I wanted to first begin by asking you about the labor movement in Bangalore and how your journey began with this movement.
Well, my association with the labor movement came from what I believed in during my student days. I was a student activist, and as a result of that, I was exploring ideological political questions, and that took me to Marxism. And then, once priority was how to make that a lifelong persuasion. As a result, I decided to specialize in labor law. I did my master's in labor law, and that continued into the world of labor law practice. And labor law practice, fortunately, I was in the company of a great labor lawyer, number one of the best in Karnataka, by the name of MC Narasimhan.
Okay.
So he was himself president of the Karnataka state AITUC. And so it was a combination of actual field work, struggles, and the use of labor law in multiple ways through the labor department and the judiciary. And so I got attracted to all of them and quickly got absorbed more into the trade union part of the labor movement and less into the legal side in terms of judicial processes. But I was able to get a good, view about labor law. And so I was one of those trade union people who knew labor law as well as was organizing labor actually.
Okay. So, what is the trade union journey for you then? Where did it begin? Started with AITGC?
Yes, I was part of the AITUC and an organizer of the AITUC. So all the unions that I worked with were affiliated to AITUC. But that was a period of time when we did not go chasing trade unions. I think our movement was so successful that everyday workers would come with a request to form a trade union.
Okay.
And so we evolved a kind of trade union framework, which I have, experience of discussing with you earlier, called the Engineering and General Workers Union.
Okay.
So that was a form of trade unionism which we felt was necessary. And so a small group of us who were working together at that time, we created a new constitution for the Engineering and General Workers Union. The crux of it is that if a small unit wanted to form a trade union, we didn't go about registering a separate union for one unit or for one enterprise. It was a general union, and so anybody who wanted to join, they just had to sign the membership form and they were part of our union. Of course, it advanced further in order to say that each unit could have its own unit of that trade union. So that was a form of trade unionism which took off very successfully in Karnataka, particularly in Bangalore. If you go on setting up one union after another in each enterprise, then that's a form of chasing the registrar of trade unions, asking them, will you please register our trade union? And each time those fellows would have some new objection to come up with and place new obstacles and a lot of unnecessary delay. So we completely bypassed that route, and if we formed one union, and then there was no need to go and request the labor department for anything to do with our unionization. It became our internal business, and that's the spirit of trade unionism. Among all the legal formalities, legal personalities that you can create, trade union, registered society, a trust, a non-profit company, a collective. Among all of them, I believe that the trade union is the most democratic and effective form of creating a legal personality. And so we did that very well and got established. So Labor Department, the registrar of trade unions, had no role to play so far as our unionization was concerned, except that we had to be compliant with the rules of the Trade Union Act.
So, when you don't set up a union within a manufacturing unit within a factory, uh, what, what does organizing look like at the factory level?
Yeah, it mimics a trade union which would have been created for a particular factory.
But you only have a set of one worker maybe or two workers.
No, no, we would have a regular election process at every enterprise. And so we would elect the president, the vice president, the general secretary, the treasurer from factory level workers. And then all these, from coming from many factories would come together and elect the office bearers of the general trade union. So there was a new kind of organizational style established.
Was this different from what existed before?
Yes, earlier it used to be a lot of individual unionization, enterprise level unionization, which is very cumbersome and fragmentary. This form of unionization would easily render itself open to solidarity action, because it was the banner of the all the unions was the same, and so it was a method of overcoming multiplicity of trade unions.
How did this framework evolve and
Experience, it's a group of us who were all experiencing, making of unions, and we found that we were wasting such a lot of time getting the registrar of trade unions to approve a particular bylaws and constitution and say, okay, you can now form a trade union. We bypassed it so effectively that we didn't have to go to them at all.
So when was this happening and why was it called the engineering and general workers?
Because the majority of units in Pina industrial area, which is what I used as my base for trade unionism, were engineering units. And engineering would mean proper engineering or electronics or information technology or pharmaceuticals. That's why we called it engineering and general workers union. So that the word engineering did not limit the form of unionization, so engineering and general workers. And in that manner, any small scale industry could virtually enroll into our union, and we had all varieties of them, and they were, so it was an area based consciousness that we created among the workers. Very often one unit would extend support to another unit where it was necessary, and the bulk of such situations was when employers would refuse to call you for negotiation. Then we would write our first love letter to them. We have formed a union and 100% of the workers in your factory are members of our union. So we welcome you to sit and negotiate with us. And the employers would go to their advisors, employers organizations, and from their experience they would say, look, it's better to recognize this union, otherwise you had it. And so we managed to get de facto recognition and we proceeded with negotiations, etc.
So, what kinds of negotiations would take place at this time?
Well, almost you had two variants. One is those employers who listen to the advice of the employers' organizations and advisors of the employers. They are also lawyers or people from HR department, etc. So, if they accepted it and decided to negotiate with the union, then the first hurdle was crossed. In such cases, we would quickly meet with the general body and say, what are your grievances? And we ascertain their grievances, and that's how the Charter of Demands is born. So it's basically the Charter of Demands which is articulated, and then that we send that to the management and say, here is a charter, let's begin negotiations. But if it was the other route where, say, some employers would say, no, we are not going to negotiate with you, then that became the focal point of our struggle, and that was uncompromising. And that would very often lead to protests and sometimes strikes and sometimes prolonged strikes. And the only demand was you have to talk to the union. So, of course, there what we did was, again, to be pragmatic, we preferred the route of de facto recognition as against de jure recognition. Now, that means under the Trade Union Act, you only have the right to form a registered trade union. Recognition doesn't follow. And so recognition, formal recognition, is a slightly more cumbersome route. And so we opted for de facto recognition, which meant the moment you start negotiating with us, we consider that you have registered us, recognized us. So we're not bothered with that question. Let's get on with collective bargaining. So that was the dominant method that we used. We didn't waste time on formal recognition procedures.
So, would you actively go to unions and talk about the benefits of unionization of your or
See,
would workers themselves come?
bulk of our trade unions were born under big trees. Yeah, we would agree to meet in the nearest location convenient for workers, and we would go there. We would go there and call everybody together and say, what do you want to do? Why do you want to form a union? Ask them, why do you want to form it? That would be the first round of genuine grievances from their side. And it very often used to be the question of dignity from management, and that some basic rights should be available. So we would narrate experiences of other factories and inform this new group. And on that basis, through a discussion process, we would draw up a charter of demands. Over a period of time, a charter became quite common type of demands. Just this basic demand would always be uh, wage question, hours of work, conditions of work. Social security we never had to fight for because EPF and ESI Act applied. And as a result, social security, unlike today what is denied to the maximum extent is the minimum social security standards as promised in ILO Convention 102. So we didn't spend much time with that. Our only concern was make sure that you get yourself registered in the EPF and the ESI, and this is how you should be. And when we negotiate with the employers, we would say you must make sure that each pay slip contains the minimum details about what is the EPF number, ESI number, and then follow up that in our own way.
Okay. Follow up in what way?
Follow up to make tell the workers this is how you can find out how much provident fund has accumulated, and then what are you doing about make sure that you pay the ESI, check whether the employer has making his contribution, those kind of follow up measures.
So you said it was area-based consciousness. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, Bangalore has many industrial areas, and so I would think at that time Pune was undoubtedly the biggest industrial area because the Pune industrial area was at one point of time the largest in Asia. It extended to phase 5, phase 6, kept on and expanding. The other area was partly in the Mysore Road. Whitefield was another big area. And then something on the Kanakapura Road, and now later on into the Bommasandra. So, areas where the workforce is working, where the factories or enterprises are located. So, that was our, and we even had a division of labor. Especially, I was able to achieve that between AITUC and CITU, largely a broad understanding. Let's not disturb each other's union by forming one more union. And you concentrate on expanding in your area, we will concentrate in our area. When we need to do solidarity, let's come together. So that was an unwritten rule which produced good results.
So what was Pune industrial area like, if you can remember?
It is a combination of big factories, medium factories, and small scale industry. And it had engineering as well as electronics was beginning to grow, and pharmaceutical. Those are the three distinct lines which emerged, but nothing in the area of garments, etc. At that point of time. So that was
Also where workers lived?
no, workers came from the neighboring villages. And that proved to be a great advantage because solidarity action extended into the village level. And so, very often, the manifestation of strike was to pitch a tent in front of the factory, and all workers would come and sit in the factory every day. And then, because we had support from the villages, we would be able to provide food also. Cooking would happen in those tents, in those places. And that was a very unique form of solidarity between urban based workers and their families back home. So that gave us unlimited strength.
So this, where were the villages?
In and around Pinya, Tumkur Road.
Okay.
So many of them were children of farmers or other rural households.
Okay. And these, you would go to the villages also to.
Yes, quite often, there were other social events, etc. It may be for a marriage, it may have been for some, death, funeral, or sometimes if there were a large number of workers in a particular village, then they would say, let's have an informal meeting in the village. And so, after our union in that area, when the factories started closing and unionization suffered, then many union leaders of the factories, they became the local leaders in the rural area and in the villages. So they already had the experience of leadership, and that leadership made them natural leaders in the rural setting. So many of them got into the Panchayati Raj, etc. Of course, the sad thing, I don't want to elaborate on it, is some of them got into real estate business. They were very successful in that regard. I know one big real estate guy in that area who would even now give us complete support if it is an AITC unit, even to this day. And his language would be, "Oh, comrade, you all have come. Please let me, you can take my facilities free of cost." So that bonhomie exists. Some of them even belong to the rival political parties. In spite of it, their affiliation in the past to the AITUC went beyond political colors. Of course, the other way around also, AITUC unions never won any local election. So they would have many of them would be part of the opposition politics. Yet there was this experience that we gained many things from the AITUC union, and so they had respect for the red flag.
Okay. Uh, these were the workers who formed part of your union were young men.
Yes, young men, largely men. Occasionally, sorry?
Were they skilled or did they come?
Not very skilled, but they would have, hardly completed schooling. The majority of them were. I don't think they, were English educated. And so I can remember.
Work in an engineering unit or a factory, some amount of skilling would have been necessary.
Yes, a lot of it was gathered through experience. Yeah, maybe at the highly, the categorization would be unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled, highly skilled, supervisory. So as you went up the skill level, you would see more and more education and sometimes training. But I think the bulk of it was training obtained through work experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did these factories at this point go into these villages and recruit young men wholesale, or were they contractors? Trying to understand how the recruitment pattern.
Yeah, we haven't paid much attention to it, but they were all looking for local workers. And Canada, the idea of migrant labor from outside the locality was alien. So I don't remember a single non-Kannada speaking person inside the trade union. At best, it may have been Telugu, Tamil, to some extent Malayalam. Otherwise, the major composition was Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, yeah, and yeah, that's so those are the language groups. Except in the public sector, we always had quite a smattering of people from all over India, and so that was a different. Every public sector under.
In the public sector?
Yes, I was actively involved with the Bharat Electronics Employees Union, the big public sector company. So through that, we were part of the Joint Action Front, which brings together all the central public sector trade unions. So the Joint Action Front was a mighty trade union movement in Bangalore. And we were the sort of foundation stone for public sector action all over the country. And that is because of the fact that circumstantially it happened. BEL, HAL, HMT, BEML, BHEL, 5 central public sector undertakings had their factories here. So this was the city in India which had the maximum central public sector undertakings in one place. So it became a hub of that.
Okay. So is that what leads to this labor movement in?
No, I wouldn't say that. Except that, in terms of union presence at a wider level, for example, when there was a crisis among the farmers, then the movement, solidarity developed between public sector workers and farmers movement. And that happened because at that time, public sector unions were on a strike of all the factories in Bangalore, and that coincided with the government killing some farmer leaders in firing. So then the farmers started to on a long march from Gulbarga, North Karnataka, especially from Nargund and Navalgund. Those are the areas from where the procession started, and that was about 600 kilometers of march from their places to Bangalore. All along the route, trade unions received them. It was an extraordinary memory of green flags and red flags together. And that had its highest point was in Bangalore because we had the highest concentration. So we received them with giving them food when they arrived in Bangalore. And that food was provided by workers and their families producing chapatis. And so we stored all those chapatis in Guruguntepalia, and the chapatis reached the roof, that much of production. And so it could be shared with all of them. It was extraordinary bonhomie. That movement was called the Pragatipara Janatantra Ranga, a united forum of progressives, including the workers, and that has its own long.
Could you maybe tell a little bit about how this conversation between the trade union and the farmers come to place?
Yeah, because on the one hand, workers were all the public sector workers were on strike. On the other hand, it coincided with the atrocities on farmers, and so the farmers' movement in protest had started. And so when they started from different places, central trade unions like AITUC, CITU, largely AITUC and CITU, we decided we'll extend solidarity to the farmers. And so then they were received in all the industrial towns of Karnataka along the way. So that's how it happened. It was a largely spontaneous, but there was a conscious element of wanting to build worker peasant alliance. So that ideological framework was there, and it was, necessary to extend solidarity to the farmers because their leaders were shot dead in the Nargund Navalgund atrocities. And that was so powerful that the chief minister lost his position after that.
So, just to talk about the composition of the workforce, these were young men in these factories in and around Bangalore. Were there any presence of women workers?
Depending upon the type of factory, some factories would recruit women. I can recollect that those who were engaged in the production of biscuits, they used to recruit women. In the public sector, those who were trying to do electronic engineering, more specifically those who were trying to produce microchips, what you call as semiconductors, etc. In BL had a semiconductor department. There were only two semiconductor departments manufacturing in India. One was in BL and the other was in Punjab. The Punjab one got burnt down, and the BL one was in production, but at that time the BL management did not recognize its importance. Now they have gone back to wanting to re-stimulate the production of semiconductors, because we had at that time Homi Bhabha's report which said semiconductors are the building blocks of the electronics industry. I must say that even the Nehruian framework didn't recognize that report adequately. We used to raise it with the management in BL, but it didn't click very much at that time. Now they have gone after having lost 30, 40 years.
So, and in these departments that
Women, because you have lot to spend a lot of time looking through the microscope, because that chip industry is basically about miniaturization. How do you reduce 100 functions into less and less space, right? So it was necessary to sit and concentrate on. So it was exclusively women in that unit.
And were these women part of your unit?
Yes. I have gone and visited their departments and discussed with them and all that. When you're president of a public sector union, then you have a right to go to the shop floor and you can go and meet and inspect and understand the production process. And over a period of time, most of these industries had progressive HR people, and so it would be jointly organized. And
This is interesting. What is progressive HR?
they don't resist trade unionism. They also feel that workers are entitled to minimum set of rights. And I think in BL we had achieved a higher level, and that was, we said we must jointly monitor the productivity of the factory. And so that meant that let's sit together, our union representatives will come, you management representatives, including managers at different level. Let's see what happened during the last 3 months and what are you going to plan for the next 3 months. So it became a progressive monitoring system in order to improve productivity, because we subscribe to the idea that public sector must make profits. Not only that, there must be fair conditions of labor and fair conditions for the company to prosper. So that was tried out quite successfully, I must say. The best wage settlement in public sector across the country was initiated in Bangalore, and I might say in BL to a great extent.
Okay. Can you tell us about that settlement?
That was the result of this huge form of collective bargaining, in which very eminent people from both sides got together. And so, both sides meaning management and labor. So even though there were multiplicity, because if you take a factory like BL, it's not only Bangalore, they've got units in different parts of India. And so there is a kind of expansion into new green fields. So those factories would also elect their own union leaders. As a result, we had multiplicity of trade unions. And so we practiced something, a very innovative style of collective bargaining, and that is all the trade union leaders from across the country would come together and we would bargain with management representatives of that factory from all over the country. So we had a high competence level. Central trade union leaders very often, were the leadership of that union. Only thing new was that we would spend at least one full day within the trade union in order to make sure that we speak with in one voice when we are meeting with the management. So it was all, very excellent organization, and the management was also equally competent, and they would, on each issue, they would, how do you justify this? And if we said something, they would challenge that and say, you're mistaken, the reality is different. And then that was collective bargaining. It was a intellectual exercise, with workers based on their shop floor experience and management based on their experience of running the company. It became a very effective collective process.
So it's not like a management giving concessions, but
No, it was, because at the bottom of it was, will these concessions lead to profits, or will it lead to sickness in the company? And that became a relevant factor. And so, viability of the company. So, we would also be analyzing the balance sheets and seeing how do you. So, in BL negotiations, we had friends who were working in the HR department who would join the trade union informally. And so we would have information about how many thousands, should have been 30,000 workers, in different parts of India. And so all their data was available with us. Which worker is at which skill level and how many years of experience, what's his educational qualification, what's his present wage, what will it be if our demands have to be implemented, what is the gap between what we are demanding and what is there at present, what's the financial implication of that, how much turnover will go out of it, and if the existing rate of profit continues, is there enough money? So it was that's the beauty of proper collective bargaining.
Uh, to go back to the question of women in the union spaces, you said in the central trade union, central PSUs, you had these women in particular units. What was it like for you as a trade union leader to speak to these women and perhaps to convince them to join the union, or did they come forward themselves? What are the differences that you witness between having women as your comrades as opposed to?
So in the public sector, it's one story. That's not so in the private sector, partly because the extent of unionization, women members in the shop floor was higher in the public sector. And therefore, in our, we used to have a team of office bearers. Very often, people like me, we would be the president of the union. So that is because the Trade Union Act provided for outsiders to be in the trade union, and I would be an honorary member. Whereas those who are factory level workers, they are called ordinary members. So both were, eligible to become office bearers. So we would have usually president, working president, general secretary, secretary, vice presidents, treasurers. So eh, almost somewhere between 6 and 8 office bearers. Invariably, we would make sure that there are women in that group. So at least one, sometimes two women would be part of the office bearers group of in a public sector undertaking. And so then they became part of the leadership of the union. And many of them were extraordinarily committed people, and they would challenge the male leadership. But of course, within the that your understanding of this particular thing, we don't agree. And
Can you maybe recollect an example for us?
I think one example which used to come up was, you must take note of the wastage of food production in the canteen. Canteens were themselves like mini factories because they're highly automized, and You can't believe what kind of a food production system you have, because it had to produce enough food for 12,000, 15,000 workers. So those issues, women would, if it is if a department in which women workers were largely in number, then they are the ones who knew the shop floor, like this semiconductor industries. But otherwise, patriarchy prevailed.
Yeah.
I don't know a single union in which the president or vice presidents maybe, the important functionaries were always male. But they were conscious of the fact that, we must practice gender justice. So that was the formal thinking. And for that reason, it was actually accommodating women. Sometimes women fought for their own and came because of their own. When you're looking for office bearers, then you're trying to find out who on the shop floor is a good activist. And many women were naturally very good activists. So through that process, it's a combination of gender justice desire, as understood during that period of time, not as sophisticated as now, and the practicality of patriarchy. So patriarchy always won the day, I must sadly say.
What is the practicality of patriarchy?
Well, in the decision making processes, you might listen to the woman, but then all the men will get together to decide. Except sometimes, I remember a factory in Nanjangud, I think it is a textile factory, where there was a militant woman leader. And she knew no norms. She would speak out very loudly. And there was some factory level issue which she considered as violent. And so she retaliated violently. She put that person on the ground, sat on his chest and thumped him and gave him a proper dressing down. And when the issue was, she was charged with misconduct and it came before the Labour Commissioner's office. Generally, you find some way to try and hide the parts which are difficult to defend. This woman had no compunction. She got up and said, "Yeah, this is what I did, and these are the reasons why I did it." So even the department didn't know how to deal with such a person. So that's extraordinary. But I think if women leaders are properly informed and given an opportunity, they can be more militant than men trade union people. That sometimes there are sad stories. In BL once, when we were protesting against police atrocities, we had a massive mobilization, and so that is from the unit which was furthest on Tumkur Road, where we had a union. It was almost close to Nelamangala. And so from there, a strike started, and the strike was in order to demand the release of 4 office bearers of a factory named Mysore Wire and Metal Industries. That was a mercenary kind of management. And so they were arrested in Yashwantpur police station and tortured. And so I went and demanded their release, and the policemen laughed at me. And so we decided to protest and mobilized. And so that mobilization, by the time it reached Jalahalli Cross, it had become massive mobilization. And somebody started a false rumor, I don't know from which quarters, saying that these workers are coming to burn down the Yashwantpur police station. Nobody had any such idea. Of course, we were marching in order to make our demands that the workers should be released. And so it was clear that we are now on the verge of a lathi charge and tear gas and maybe police firing. And so somebody started saying, see, put the women workers in front of the procession, then the police will not attack them. So we gave a call. So you imagine a big procession in which, with that decision, it could be implemented. So women workers came to the front of the procession, and we continued to march towards Jalali Cross. But as we reached Jalali Cross, the police started lathi charge and tear gas, and the bulk of the injuries were sustained by women workers. Some of them received tear gas shells on their chest, and they took a long time to recover. So that was one of those foolish decisions that the trade union, under the illusion that if there are women workers, they won't be attacked by male policemen. Nothing of the sort. When there is, when we say fire, fire to kill. When we say charge, charge like a bull. That's how they are taught in their training centers, the policemen. I was inside a police van when they started this atrocity, and what I can never forget is the policemen who were employing tear gas shells, etc. For them, it was as if it was a Deepavali festival, enjoying it from their end. And so that's the conditioning which those who are in charge of breaking up receive within the police establishment, completely blind to.
Uh, so these were workers who you gathered along the way from.
Yes, yes, from one factory after another. So, it was no notice.
Private sector.
Yes, largely on that route, private sector.
And then how did it eventually end?
Well, the police broke it up at Jalahalli Cross, but the higher police officials produced these workers who were in Yashwantpur police station, brought them and released them at Jalahalli police station, and said, please call off the strike. And the mood of the workers was, no, we want to go and register our protest. We are happy that you released the workers. And so then the police decided, they felt that, it might lead to some violence in the police, some such notion which we couldn't understand. So they let loose.
So these collective bargaining settlements that you previously spoke about, were these only in public sector undertakings?
No, no, no. Hundreds of private sector collective bargaining. Public sector was rare because it would be once in 5 years, and there are only limited number of public sector. Central public sector only five, whereas factories are run thousands.
What is the motivation for private sector management to come to the table with
They had a difficult time, but I would always think that employers' advisors would advise them what are the consequences for and against dealing with union. And more and more people decided to use the method of bargaining, because one feature which trade unions, most central trade unions, including AITUC, followed was, if you sign a collective bargaining settlement, then you honor the terms and conditions of that settlement during the duration of that settlement. So we would generally negotiate for a 3-year settlement. And during that 3-year period, there would be wage increase, neutralization against price rise, that is dearness allowance. That was a demand which we would fight for. And the other demand which is now disappeared sadly is this demand, the new settlement will apply not only to workers who are on the rolls as on the day of signing, but also to those who will be recruited in future. And so our idea was that the wage level shouldn't be structured in a manner in which newcomers will be placed below the others. So all those elements were part of collective bargaining. Of course, there would be the counter voice from within the trade union. We have worked for 10 years, why are these people who come in yesterday getting the same wage? So then we built in the seniority clause, that for every year of service there must be some additional weightage. So all that was part of the wage settlement process. Very elaborate, detailed, hugely educative, and a lot of experiences. How do you create a wage scale? What are the increments in that wage scale? And how do you differentiate between different skill levels, and what's the beginning of the wage scale, what is the end of the wage scale, what happens when the end of the scale is arrived at, and all lot of experiential learning, not from textbooks but from each other's experiences. So an old trade union would have the experience of that process earlier, and so a lot of expertise flowed from experienced people, I would say. You see, we used to keep in mind the engineering wage board recommendations that came from Bengal. And that is what taught us how to classify industries based upon relevant criteria. That's where this work had happened earlier, quite earlier part.
Wow.
Yeah, engineering wage board recommendations.
Um, so you must have also then seen the gradual deindustrialization of the Indian industrial area.
Yes, I think the remarkable things happened post neoliberalism. Then privatization started, and then the public sector also lost its fervor. Earlier, the public sector and the small scale industry was working in tandem. The public sector encouraged small scale industry. Some public sector undertakings had their own industrial estate, as part of the public sector, though it was, they would have a separate campus for it. It was close to the factory, and the understanding was what they produce would be taken in by the bigger producers. So there was a organic, relationship, yeah, a kind of ancillarization. That broke down slowly. And then I think the earlier industrial policy resolution of India at the macro level, as well as the legislation corresponding to it, the Industrial Regulations Act, that recognized that there should be, public sector, private sector, medium scale, large scale, small scale, tiny scale. And so there was the macroeconomic policy itself encouraged that process. That slowly got eroded. Now it is spoken of more in abstract, unrealistic terms. But at that time, it was pushed into practice. So that helped industrialization, because as we know, the maximum employment is generated in the small scale industry. And that changed with neoliberalism.
That also seemed to have brought about, in some sense, the opening up of the garment industry as well to more and more changes and to a more feminized workforce.
That's true. Yeah, I think the employers had some, notion of division of labor in their own heads. And in this part, I think in South India, and Bangalore included, they were more inclined to have women in the workforce. Not just, it was not tokenistic. It was men's presence would be tokenistic. It was women who constituted the bulk of the. Unlike in parts of North India, where there are men who are, into the garment sector. So why did that happen in South India? Probably they also found that women labor is cheaper. Women labor can be more easily exploited. And so all those conditions have also contributed to it. Women labor have never had the experience of working for 8 hours.
Yeah.
They would always very easily be manipulated to work for, and there would be a inarticulated connection between their wage level and the hours of work. So let's say X amount of wage is promised, but they would tie it up to productivity and say, okay, you will get that wage provided you produce so much. And so that, whereas productivity in collective bargaining is the result of a lot of work, and the key part of that work would be, beyond 8 hours, you'll have to pay double wages for overtime. Here, even when the minimum wage is introduced for garment workers, that minimum wage will operate even if it is 12 hours of work, which is against all known ethics of labor relationships. But that became the common practice. And women fell into that, because those women who came in search of employment had so many social reasons why they wanted the employment. And so they were willing to be exploited.
What are some of the social reasons you encountered?
I think, as women, the social process in the countryside, etc., unemployment in the rural areas. So many young women wanted to find their own space, wanted their own independence, and they would grab any opportunity to find employment. Initially in the neighborhood, and later on willing to travel. Many would come on the train, traveling, more than 100 kilometers, looking for employment on the periphery of an urban center. So you had that phenomenon in a big way.
Can you recollect when you first encountered the garment?
Yeah, I was one of those. I was not playing an active role in garment unionization, but people would invite me from the garment sector to come and share my experiences of unionization, for which we had long historical experience, especially small scale industry. And so I would often interact at that level, and that stimulated in me a desire to know more about the conditions of garment workers, because the conditions of engineering and small scale I knew very well from my experience. But to get that, it was difficult to meet the women workers. As soon as the siren blew, they would run, to reach their homes. And through experience, I realized that many of them also travel by train. So I remember I decided to catch a train along with them. And so that would give you enough time for while they were traveling 50 to 100 kilometers. And after some initial resistance, if they felt that this is a bona fide fellow who's interested in labor relations, they became friendly. And so then they would chat, and it was an informal conversation which the trade unions never provided space for. Trade unions are very bureaucratic, they are top heavy, and they think they have all the answers. But when you go into a train compartment and start conversation with the woman, you can't say, "This is my agenda now, let's tick off one by one." They would all talk, everybody. And so that is a lovely process of education and democratic interaction. So, well, it's all their working conditions. It's how they are exploited and how there is no limit to the working hours, how difficult it is go to the restroom, how supervisors get into sexual harassment, and how they would clearly articulate that if you want to work less hours, you better become pally with me. All varieties of antisocial processes would be, and they would narrate that. Only if they gained your confidence would they tell you everything. Otherwise, especially matters related to sexual harassment, they don't like to talk even in public. And so you also don't press them, but you recognize something and then see who are the people from among them with whom we can, within a trade union frames, try and have discussions. So it was more, but in spite of it, for whatever reasons, I think because I was extraordinarily active in the public sector and in new unionization in which there were no other takers, among which were two. One was hospital unionization, hospital workers, and the other was hotel workers. So hotel workers unionization led me from Bangalore city to Delhi, and we took up collective bargaining in the India Tourism Development Corporation hotels, which were hundreds of hotels across the country. So that was another form of collective bargaining at a national level. And hospitals was largely in Bangalore city, but we unionized more than 20 hospital workers. And through our struggles, we got minimum wages for hospital workers for the first time, including junior doctors and nurses and all that. So those minimum wages are still in operation.
But I have been told that minimum wages are supposed to actually be for informal workers where they don't have, and not necessarily for workers who are within recognized factories, where actually collective bargaining settlements have to be followed. But what we are seeing in the garment industry is that the minimum wage is the standard that factories follow, and there's no documented instance of any collective bargaining that any union has been able to achieve, at least in the extended Bangalore region. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, first of all, I think your observation is correct. Where you have a recognized trade union which has been into collective bargaining, then minimum wage notification is irrelevant because you crossed it and you're going towards what we call as a fair wage.
Yeah.
The fair wage level is above the minimum wage level. So we are always bargaining about a fair wage, and after some 20 years of bargaining and settlements, they have reached a living wage level where the starting wage will be somewhere between 50 and 60,000 for an unskilled worker. There are such factories in which I have, from the day of unionization, that is the day when the employers would resist, and now those unions have become very strong unions. So there are unions in which we have achieved living wage. On the other hand, we have factories where minimum wage itself is not achieved, and that minimum wage itself is not what it ought to be normatively speaking. The average minimum wage now in Bangalore is about 16,000, but it's the garment workers who got the worst deal out of that, and their wages are far below the normative minimum wage for other comparable industries. So that has its own history, and that's the weakness largely of the trade union movement. So if there's no trade union, then there is a gap. First of all, the normative minimum wage itself becomes less, as in the case of garment workers. That's a manipulation which unfortunately gets sanctified by judicial processes. When the minimum wage notification comes now in Bangalore, you can expect about 400 employers to come together in order to challenge that minimum wage. So they have a powerful advocacy and lobbying group, and they go as petition. Even there, yes.
Or
So
across industry?
yeah, across industry, but I think governments are very, they have done it more effectively. And so they have been able to get what I would call as wrong orders from the higher judiciary, as a result of which their wages have stagnated. And I think the proof of that statement that I am making is, you look at the minimum wages across different sectors and you have to answer the question, why is it that the garment workers are getting so much lesser than comparable minimum wages, and the figures speak for themselves. You know, there is the phenomenon in judicial decision making called as consequentialist approach. This means when you're giving a judgment, you must keep in mind what are the consequences of your judgment. So, a judge who is looking at minimum wages, if he looks at the consequences, the most glaring consequences as a result of his decision, the garment workers are drawing much lesser than other comparable, and he should ask himself why so. And so, if the consequentialist aspect is dominant in the brain of the judge, in the heads of the judges, then they wouldn't give the type of stay orders that they are giving now. And as a result of it, judiciary has been a huge contributor to the further exploitation of garment women in India, in Bangalore.
Why do you think that in the story that you narrated, for instance, the judiciary didn't figure at all? It was the management and the union. Why is it that there has become this need to move one either to the judiciary or to brands, global brands?
In my own trade union experience, I realized that taking the legal route for redressal is far more cumbersome than going to the gate meeting. So, in other words, if you had the bargaining capacity at the factory level, then you would get quick benefits. Whereas you take a dispute to this wretched judicial machinery, it will take you years. It's now common knowledge that if you want to get relief from the judiciary for a worker right violation, it will be somewhere between 10 and 15 years. By which time, if you had a good collective bargaining unit, you would assign 3 settlements. So naturally, people like me, we opted for the collective bargaining. That's why I'm a trade union activist whose primary interest was setting up unions. I have created a slogan for myself, which is the following: the extent of implementation of labor laws is directly proportional to the extent of unionization. Everything else falls apart, falls aside. It's not the labor inspector who gets implementation done. It's not the judiciary or the labor court. It's your collective bargaining strength, and that's a legitimate part of the Industrial Disputes Act and the Trade Union Act. And so that jurisprudence exists. But if you want to invoke that jurisprudence, you have to build a trade union. There is no other alternative. So that was my conviction. But I must add, very importantly, I didn't realize until many, many decades later that what I was practicing was the rights based approach. What does that mean? I would explain to the workers, these are your legal rights. And when I say legal rights, these are the views that are enunciated by the judiciary in India. So there were good decisions in the judiciary. And that knowledge I got from the person with whom I was practicing labor law, and that is MC Narasimhan. So we had used every subclause of the Industrial Disputes Act in on the field. So our knowledge of that law was extraordinarily good. So much so, when we went to the Labour Department, the Labour Department recognized that our knowledge of law was far superior to that. Some of them would occasionally test it, and they would bow their head in recognition of the fact that our knowledge was superior. I remember one proposition where the Labour Commissioner said, from where are you talking? What is this? You seem to be simply talking through your hat. I said, please pick up that book behind your shelf, and turn to this chapter. And then I read it out and told him, this is what I'm talking about. After that, that Labour Commissioner had such high respect for me. Whatever I said, he took as the legally correct proposition. So we had developed that internal capacity through Narasimhan's efforts. He would give us legal education. Even the trade union activists, we would all be educated in the law, and they would all, will say, you see, this factory management says this is the interpretation. Is that correct? And Narasimhan always had a creative interpretation, which was, pro-labor. So he's a person who cannot be forgotten in Bangalore city's labor jurisprudence. There was another person like him by the name of Subbarao. And these two were the left-oriented lawyers in the courts. And the court itself had high respect for him. I remember when minimum wages were challenged, it is for the government to come and defend the minimum wage. But the judge would ask, where is Narasimhan? and they'll say, no, he's in the labor court. Then the judge will say, keep aside this file, let Narasimhan come. And so even though he is not a party to that particular case, the judge would presume that who can represent the minimum wage cost better than MC Narasimhan. And so the poor labor government leader would recede into the background, and Narasimhan would take over the leading role in the court. And we got so many good judgments as a result of that. It's a pity by the time the government, issues went to the High Court, Narasimhan was too old. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened. But sadly, there was a huge gap in terms of succession to follow his standard of judicial intervention. Now a young group is coming up. It'll probably take a few more years. Of course, in the meanwhile, the judiciary also has got, as to use Upendra Bakshi's words, the judiciary is structurally adjusted. So that is also a problem now. Labor jurisprudence is on the back foot.
Uh, the judiciary is one, but the other is the one that you have been part of for a very long time, the trade union movement. What were some of the conversations happening with these central trade unions in this new phenomenon of the government women worker? This is a new figure. She's emerging on the Bangalore industrial landscape in the early 2000s onwards, and she has no one to really look at her and educate her about her rights, except maybe a few NGOs that are beginning to also emerge at the same time. So, what were some of the conversations? Were there any conversations at all?
No, I must begin by recognizing the fantastic struggle launched by Surya Narayan Rao, the CITU president. He had fought in a particular group of garment industries, and that was a long drawn out struggle. But sadly, the other central trade unions and others did not rise to the occasion. Even AITC did not. I don't think AITC had any substantial unionization in the garment workers. So that was there. So Suri was Suri means Surya Narayan Rao. Suri was aware of this, and so he knew that we had to do some path breaking work, and he started that. But that also coincided with the period when the trade union movement was on the low ebb. We always see a low ebb and a high wave. So this was the low ebb. As a result, the employers managed to break that strike. And when a strike of that nature is broken, it sends out a negative message that, look, be careful of unionization. You lose your job and nobody can help you. So that prevailed, and that logic has not yet been overcome. The first time that logic was overcome was when the garment workers, the women workers, realized that the last straw on the camel's back has fallen, and so they decided it was spontaneous outpouring. And so you had that big PF's Provident Fund strike. So it's interesting they picked up the Provident Fund issue, and what they were saying is, according to the rules that were prevailing at that time, they are entitled to take loans from the Provident Fund, and that's the only way in which they can live, because the wages they are getting is below the living standard. It's a subsistence wage, or even lesser than a subsistence wage. So they would manage to break both ends meet by taking loans from the PF. So the PF central government decided to withdraw that facility, and then the workers spontaneously, it's not the result of unionization, it's the result of anger among women workers. And so that's a constituency which is dynamite by itself, and they used it, and the strike was so all powerful that the central government had to retrace their false steps within a matter of 2 or 3 days. I can hardly remember any strike. You must understand one thing: when you go on a strike at an enterprise level, let us say for reducing the working hours, then that strike becomes an economic strike. But with the type of strike which the women workers manifested in the garment industry, it's a political strike. It's the scale just changes. You're not talking to one employer. Yeah, you're saying, you fellows in charge of PF, you better take back this rule. We are not going to accept it. It's not an economic demand, it's a political demand. So that's the beauty of trade unionism. There's a great labor jurist by the name of Otto Kahn Freund. He has an excellent labor jurisprudence formulation, and that is the following: that When a worker gets into an employment, he is signing an individual contract of employment. The contract law prevails. But when unionization and collective bargaining takes place, the individual contract of employment is thrown into the dustbin, and the collective contract of employment becomes the one that is in force. So it's a complete change of contract law, and it is substituted by labor law. That is labor jurisprudence. So that's the power of collective bargaining.
But why do you think collective bargaining has not happened in the garment industry? Some have said that it's because of the fact that it is a like women-dominated workforce.
I wouldn't accept that. If that was so, how did they have this fantastic political struggle?
But
It's
the strike was not against garment factory.
yeah. If you can challenge a bigger enemy, then why is it that same women workforce can't challenge a smaller enemy? So it's not the gender question. It is the inability to unionize, and maybe that is because of patriarchal, bureaucratic trade union leadership and its habits. They have a tendency to go and reap more benefits from where it is easily available. And so people like Suri, who wanted to go beyond that, showed the path, but unfortunately, I would think even now, the single most important thing that central trade unions can do is all get together and decide that we will fight for the next 10 years for garment workers, cutting across affiliation. We will form a form of organization, which is best known as a platform. Please form a platform of garment workers and take that up, and let all trade union leaders work together. We will not allow fragmentation. That will make a big progress. There are trends in that direction which have yet to fructify.
But uh, unlike sectors where there's a lot of investment into, say, machinery, factory, and other paraphernalia. One of the key features of the garment industry is its footloose capital, and that it can move. A factory can close down overnight. You just have to pick up the machines and move it out to someplace else where there is unorganized or unmobilized labor. And that seems to be one of the, I mean, and that's happened. It's not like not just a fear. It has actually happened that garment factories have constantly been shutting down, and so one that affects, of course, the membership of the union, and the other is also that it allows for fear to spread. And so, in that sense, it's very different from the from what you encountered or what you were part of in earlier decades in Bangalore. So, does what do you think is this then possible, this platform that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think there is the dominant labor jurisprudence which originates many decades ago. Immediately after independence, we had what is called as the Industrial Truce Resolution, 1947. And the Industrial Truce Resolution said that capital must have an opportunity to create more profits. Its production and profitability must be encouraged, but simultaneously fair labor conditions must be observed. So the government of India's philosophy was conditioned by that. So if you look at all the labor laws that exist, they subscribe to that model, and a good bit of trade unionism in India was also along that model. While left trade unions, always were critical and carried on propaganda against the capitalist mode of production. But if you go deeper into it, let me mention that every settlement that is signed between a trade union and an employer, in its own way, is strengthening capitalism, because you're showing that capitalism works and it's necessary, if you want to improve your condition. So that's a philosophical framework. If you are informed by that philosophical framework, then you are able to make progress for achieving what is called good industrial relations. The essence of it is what is contained in the truce resolution. It's interestingly the same truce resolution is repeated at the time of the Chinese aggression, when there's a national consensus that all should be united in national interest, like I suppose would be the period during this war, which we recently had, though it didn't take on the same direct dimensions for other reasons. So labor law and industrial law, etc., subscribe to that view, where trade unions departed from that by adopting extra militant postures. Trade unions suffered. And I think,
Extra militant posture.
yeah,
What
I,
does that mean?
that means, I think the best example of it is Gerao in West Bengal.
Okay.
Gerao as a method of struggle.
Okay.
So Gerao is, resulted in factories having to close down. And that capital came to Bangalore. And when they came to Bangalore, they found the industrial relations philosophy and framework here very positively different from their own experience. And that encouraged collective bargaining. And so that is, I think, a relevant factor in all these matters.
How is it that it's not worked in the current?
I think neoliberalism has wrecked that framework.
Now in this post neoliberal.
If you, if post neoliberalism picks up more momentum, then ironically, a good illustration of it is the Prime Minister of India articulating his faith in Atmanirbharata post the war. That's the earliest sign of going back to the industrial truth resolution at the level of macroeconomic thinking. It's yet to percolate, but it's interesting. But sadly, it is the lessons are learned from defense production. How will it percolate to other areas? I think it will percolate because capital is also watching. And you can see the extraordinary enthusiasm with which capitalists are coming to get into the defense production area. Of course, their motivation is always profit. But what is Atmanirbharata in that? That happened because DRDO and ISRO, etc., were self sufficient organizations. Of course, they don't like to acknowledge that they were able to do so because of the Soviet Union, because you got technology from there. You were in Bangalore, Satish Dhawan was instrumental in opening out the cryogenic engine and then making drawings of it and then and making a production inside. Indigenization of the cryogenic engine is what has made the space program successful, and that is possible because the Soviet Union had no intellectual property rights. They said, yes, please go ahead and understand it for yourself. The capitalist world doesn't think like that. Instead, today it's the multinationals who want to come into defense production. So while part of their understanding, the government of India is right, the other part is wrong because they are, going to sell their technological development developed by the defense industry of India, which is through the public sector. ISRO is a public sector. All the difficult work to make it successful has put in, its Indian capital, Indian national capital, not from the capitalists but from the Indian budgetary allocation. Now, when profits are around visible, then the private sector wants to come in for PPP. So whatever profits, they'll walk off with it, and that will, in the long run, subvert your Atmanirbharata. That will happen if you look at the BrahMos missile. That is what allowed you to win the Pakistan war. And of course, very quickly and interestingly, the defense ministry has started a defense corridor in Uttar Pradesh, and they're going to internalize, manufacture BrahMos. Private sector is waiting to get down to it, and that this neoliberalism thinks that is the right way forward. I'm not sure whether that is the way forward. So, what do you understand by Atmanirbharata? There, it's interesting that some RSS leaders are critical or articulate Atmanirbharata in a way which is different from the way the government of India understands it. That requires further research.
Uh, there is no move towards Atmanirbharta in the garment supply chain, given that it's, at least in Bangalore, that the ready-made garment industry is oriented towards the Western markets in particular, and that's where all the transnational apparel corporations are based as well. So, for unions, the two modes of appeal have been either at the either at the state level to work with minimum wages, or in the case of a particular industrial dispute, to work with the labor department, or to appeal to the brands as to intervene in some ways. That seems to have been two primary modes of union led activism in the garment industry. Um, what do you think?
Yeah, there is a lot of truth in that. The supply chain and its dependence on export orientation is a huge factor. But if you look at the international experience, what is encouraged unrelentlessly is race to the bottom. So how do you set up one group against another group within a city, within a state, within the country, across countries? So that phenomenon is happening. And so part of the solution lies in encouraging an internal market for garment for production. Then the parameters change. And the other is, I think it has begun the use of technology in order to achieve higher productivity, etc. And there are stages in technological innovation where the contribution of the worker becomes quite critical. I suppose in future that will be destroyed through artificial intelligence. But there's a stage at which worker participation is important. We are seeing it in many engineering industries. We see it particularly in pharmaceutical. So where an industry wants good productivity and good quality productivity, then they soon realize that you must win the support of the workers. And there's a long tradition in India that worker support is maximized when you have good relations with trade unions. And so I can see in Bommasandra area, more than a dozen factories where during this period of neoliberalism they've signed good settlements. And those are good settlements in which contract labor is minimal and wages are better than the minimum wage. And that's because of the realization that you must win the workers' cooperation in order to make sure that pharmaceutical products are of standard. So the levels of consequences of bad pharmaceutical quality is directly visible, both internationally and nationally, more so internationally. So those are structural features, and from that point of view, we need to keep studying the garment industry to see what trends should be encouraged and what's the importance of an internal market. And internal market is a very important factor in moving towards self-reliant production.
Do you remember? Were you able to remember the study that you put together, study team that you put together, that I told you about Shakun and others that
Yeah.
um, uh, that you recruited them into studying the
Yeah.
garment industry?
Yeah, I always remember Shakun and Madhu and that group of women activists, feminist activists. So it was always a pleasure to work with them. And so during the heyday of my trade union, I must have reached out to them, but I have forgotten that. I'm not even sure what happened at that time. And that's because I think that was separated by several decades, after which I must have gone sucked into other preoccupations. But I'm not surprised that we had made such an effort because there was a point of time at which different kinds of unionization and experiences we tried to learn from each other. And so Madhu and Shakun were people with whom we always enjoyed that interaction. I would be keen to get hold of the documents to refresh my own memory.
They also are not able to find it.
Uh,
Well, the last question is around the labor department, and you must have seen the labor department over the years. What are some of the things, some of the changes that you've seen? Because one of the things that the government unions like GATU, for instance, do is to regularly interact with the labor department in order to be able to make their case in dispute. So, what has been some of the changes that you have seen?
the Labor Department can play a hugely supplementary role, very occasionally even a catalytic role. But that is completely tied up to the meta narrative, to the macroeconomic policies which are prevalent, and that becomes the dominant conditioning factor of the Labor Department. So during the pre-neoliberal period in India, the Labor Department was wedded to the right kind of political economy considerations and consequently right kind of labor jurisprudence. At that time, we came across excellent, labor commissioners. All labor commissioners are from the IAS category. And so, if you have a very committed, dynamic IAS leader as labor commissioner, then that percolates to the other levels. If they are left to themselves, it's a den of corruption. And so when the meta narrative suffers, then that philosophical commitment to industrialization as well as to labor relations gets eroded at the top. When it gets eroded at the top, then the bottom of the labor department takes over, and that's a very, very corrupt experience. So I'm sympathetic to the garment industry. They're living at the wrong period of time so far as this dimension is concerned. Occasionally, fortunately, you can find an officer who is still honest, but you come across, left to themselves, they are a corrupt lot. And so the only counterdote against that is mobilization by the workers. Employers are enjoying this period because they are hand in glove. And so I go to the extent of saying that tripartitism, which is an ILO principle, it's covered by section ILO Convention number 44, 144, that has now, I think, fallen apart because I feel that the material conditions for tripartitism has disappeared. What I mean by that is, you don't have three parties anymore. Three parties are government, employer, and trade union. Now you have only two parties. The government and the employer are together. So tripartitism has become an illusory, thing which we aspire for. And I think even the ILO will have to reconsider how do you handle this condition.
That seems to have been replaced by something called these global framework agreements, or the previous version was the international framework agreement, where instead of the state, you have the global union federation along with a parent corporation somewhere negotiating.
Yes, I think that is the safety valve mechanism. You know, well informed experts at the international level who are looking at the relation between labor and capital, they want to make sure that some explosive stage is not reached, and so you provide a safety valve. That's always inadequate. Earlier, it's the union movement which set the standards. That cannot be substituted by some combination of employers and their agents. So that's the period through which we are now living, and so I don't think that's the solution. So even the ILO's commitment to its own constitutional standards and ILO conventions. ILO is the world's best organization because it started way before the United Nations organization. ILO is 1919, and that is born immediately after the Russian Revolution. Therefore, ILO is hugely influenced by socialist principles. And so all its conventions have very substantially useful provisions, but they are very slow, and I see evidence of them not subscribing to their own principles as of the moment. Yesterday or today, I read some refreshing ideas originating from the ILO. The ILO is expected to come up with a convention on gig and platform workers. And if you compare the ordinance of the government of Karnataka with those standards, and the ordinance and the processes in Karnataka and Rajasthan is far short of what it ought to be. So both the ILO and the EU, there are processes of that nature, but that itself is an uphill task. And so the overall, strength of the labor movement internationally also has suffered, but not completely destroyed. And so I think in India, the essence of it is to reverse all this. You need a powerful organization of the unorganized workers. Organized workers can't do it. Organized workers and their trade unions have reached the stage of becoming labor aristocracy. The organized workers have, especially in the public sector, become labor aristocracy. What that means is, you look at the public sector in Bangalore, they all have productivity settlements. And productivity settlement means the entire workforce is contributing to higher productivity. But the gains of productivity are cornered by the organized workers and their trade unions. And that is a relationship of labor aristocracy. Workers exploit other workers. So they use the manpower and the productivity of the unskilled majority of the contract labor, and they walk away with the benefits of it. And there's hardly any union in Bangalore which is able to fight that trend. So this is a period of labor aristocracy. Trade unions don't like to subscribe to that analysis, but I think it's time to recognize it. So it will have to be fought, and so the solution lies in huge efforts, almost like a second wave of unionization required, compared to the first wave during the days of the independence struggle and before, in order to organize the unorganized. Otherwise, these sad developments can't be reversed.
Doesn't think you think gender needs to be taken into
Yes, of course. In the next phase, we must obviously ensure equality in the processes of labor movement, no forms of discrimination. The ILO's core labor standard subscribes to it. The core labor standards is the result of a working group which was set up between the WTO and the ILO. And they initially came up with 4 core labor standards. The first one is freedom of association and collective bargaining. Second is no discrimination. Third is no forced labor. Fourth is no child labor. And now make sure that safe working conditions. The fifth is added. So those are still valid basis on which there must be organization. And when we say no discrimination, then the gender question is at the top of the list, both in terms of wage discrimination or the glass ceiling or so many other forms of discrimination. So that will all have to be, a new consciousness has to be created within the trade union movement, and the material is there for it, but it's at a period when everything is at a low ebb, and so young people must be identified and encouraged to learn from the old history and start virtually launch a new process again.